Cassis Henry Devoros, Captain Desvian Navy. POW. Retribution Captain Suite Suvakov Museum. Unfinished. Cassis! He looked up when he heard the voice calling out his name and looked around for a moment. Cassis! The voice called again, clearly searching for him. I'm in here! He called out and watched Junko walk in through the door to the museum. He pointed to a picture on the wall. It still amazed him at times the clarity with which the humans could capture moments. It almost looked like the leaves in the background were about to start blowing through the breeze. Who's this with the Admiral? Junko walked closer to peer over his shoulder. What? That's Andromeda. No, it isn't. Her fur is a different color and she looks not like her. Small. Very small. He tilted his head as he squinted a bit. He still had trouble telling the difference between some humans in pictures. He'd gotten more accustomed to their scents and sounds, but looks alone threw him off still. Well, that's because she was just a teenager back then. You do know that red isn't her natural hair color, right? Back then she was what we'd call a dirty blonde, and I think it got darker as she got older. When she said that, Cassis blinked and looked over at the woman. Then he leaned in close to her as she slowly leaned back confused. He sniffed at her hair and then frowned. Is black your natural fur color? He couldn't imagine why anyone would want to change their fur coloring. It was the basis of Desvian society, so others had a better idea of one's class without needing to ask. Hair color, she corrected, and he shrugged. And yes, this is my natural hair color. How does she cover the smell? He asked, and Junko frowned once more. What smell? Of the chemical dyes. Do your dyes not smell? The only ones I'm familiar with are used for processing of clothing and the like. He looked from her back at the picture once more. Andromeda was apparently standing next to her father then. It was on some planet where the trees had orange and reddish leaves, a snow-capped mountain towering over them in the distance. She was in some sort of gray and red uniform he didn't recognize. We have hair dyes that don't smell. But yes, that's Andromeda. I believe that was just before she was sent to the academy on Castor. It was the Confederacy's premier military training facility, a combination of high school and college and officer training. He studied her face. She was smiling, but it wasn't the sort of wild and wicked grin he was used to. It was more subdued and wry. The Admiral beside her was smiling as well, unlike in all the other pictures and paintings Cassis had found of the man. They look happy. He noticed the sword on Andromeda's hip. Even back then, it seemed like she had been training with a blade. He'd only seen her use it that first day against that four-armed Xeno, but he was confident he never wanted to duel with her, inside that armor of hers or out. I think they were. From what I've heard after the death of his beloved wife, the Admiral only smiled for two reasons: if his enemy fell into his trap, and when he spent time with his daughter. He could tell Junko was being serious, but he slowly shook his head as he looked at the picture. I find it hard to believe such a man would find pride in such a creature. Junko slapped his shoulder then, and he looked back at her. He can hear you! She hissed out and pointed to the ceiling. Cassis, however, just shrugged. I stand by my statement. This was an admiral of extreme prowess. I've examined more of his battle records on the holotable. His skills as both a tactician and strategist were remarkable. I've never seen someone set a trap so far ahead of the time when he'd snap it shut, both on the offense and especially on the defensive side of things. How could he have any pride in a pirate? Cassis knew he was just feeling extra bitter lately because of her interactions with the prince. He shifted a little and rubbed at his chin to try and hide his annoyance. You do remember that she wasn't a pirate back then. She was the Confederacy's best and brightest. Even from a young age, she showed considerable skill with a sword, and she held her own in battle simulations. By the time she graduated, Junko moved down the wall of pictures to motion for Cassis to follow. He blinked when he saw the next picture. Andromeda was in that same uniform as before, but now it had some additional ribbons along the chest and shoulders. She was standing at the front and center of a display of other humans in the same uniform, and she had a very serious and determined look on her face. She looked sane. What was this? He looked at Junko, who nodded at the picture. Her graduation. She was the most highly ranked student since her father had attended. Since the war was already draining their resources so heavily, she was made a full commander immediately. He glanced back at her, as he noticed she had made that small mistake. She was a citizen of the opposing side, was she not? So she stole the ship they gave her and became a pirate? He asked, and Junko shook her head. No, in fact, for the closing years of the war, she proved herself to be an excellent officer in her own right. In her very first engagement, she led 3 destroyers through a dead system, a minefield, and past a hostile fleet to hit 2 carriers while their squadrons were refueling and reloading. Caught them unprepared and with all their ordnance in their exposed hangars. Wiped them out in a relatively short 1-hour engagement, though it was truly over fairly quickly and most of it was finishing the carriers off. Cassis eyed the picture once more of Andromeda standing proud at the front of the other officers. Did she have trouble obeying orders? He asked then, and Junko shook her head once more. No trouble with authority? More head shaking. How can this be? The person I know does not behave like that person looks like they would. He pointed at the picture before them. Well, she was honestly a model officer. She took orders dutifully and obeyed direct commands. But most of the time she was so skilled, she was just given small commands and left to harass and delay the oncoming Congo invaders. But there are events that change a person. Junko took a deep breath and then looked over at the table before checking her watch. I guess we have time for what's probably the most important battle in regards to Andromeda and where we are now. But I'm not great at this sort of thing on my own. Let me just... She looked at that tablet she always had as Jesus looked at the wall and walked down it to look at more pictures. The concept of the carriers the humans sometimes used still confused him. He knew that their ships worked differently, but what of their pilots? How could they land fighters and bomber strike craft on a ship traveling through the void? Did they all have to wear bulky atmospheric suits? How many airlocks did that require? What about the air they'd need to haul? He was looking over some of the pictures when he paused at one that showed a massive human fleet arrayed before a reddish-brown planet. He leaned in closer to read the card beneath it. Siege of La Rosa. When he saw one of the ships had a number of holes in the side, he frowned and tilted his head. Junko, what's that? He pointed as he looked over at her. She looked up from her tablet and came closer. That is, the heavy carrier Fenrir. That was the second siege of La Rosa. It was a relatively new conglomerate territory and had a significant resistance from the settlers who didn't want conglomerate rule. The admiral helped liberate it in the early days of the war before it was taken back. She looked ready to say more, but then stopped and looked over at him. Why? Was it heavily damaged? There are all those holes in the side, but they look very even. When he pointed them out to her, she frowned. Those are just the hangars. Those are flight decks inside. It's designed like that. Cassis blinked and leaned back. What? They just leave it open to the void? So, they all wear void suits to protect themselves? Now Junko frowned. What? No, they're equipped with shields. What do you mean? Cassis had to think this through as he realized this was one of those times when his lack of knowledge about human tech was making this more confusing than it would be normally. So he looked back at the picture and squinted a bit. Wait, so... He stopped as he tried to wrap his head around what he was looking at. If the carrier loses its shields in battle, are the crews sucked into the void? And how do the fighters and bombers get out? Wait. The hangars don't use the same shields as the rest. Each opening is equipped with atmospheric shields to keep the air in that the bombers and fighters fly through freely. They aren't the same as the shields around the ship itself. Do you not have those? Now Cassis was nodding as it began to make so much more sense to him. No, our shields aren't selective. Everything is in or out until they go down. That's why we don't use those carriers like you do. Some ships have a few scout ships launched from special airlocks, but that's it. That changes everything! Now I understand. You don't need to worry about the shielding as much or your crews being sucked into the void. I can see how fielding so many craft would be useful. A shame ours are bound to planets only. This, different in technology, continues to confuse and astound me. He rubbed his chin as things finally began to fit better in his head. Well, I kind of forget at times what you know and what you don't about our ships. Junko looked back at her tablet then. Good, Stahl was on his way here already. Andromeda wants to talk to you about that system you mentioned before. The outlaw one. Cassis looked over his shoulder at the woman when she said that. Is she looking for recruits? I can imagine why she'd find more hands in such a system, but I'm not sure she'd want them. As much as I dislike her tactics, I will admit that most of her crew seems to be very professional. These pirates are the uncivilized hordes I'm more accustomed to. They're savage and bloodthirsty, which I'm sure she admires, but I doubt they'd bend a knee to a woman." He saw Junko's look and sighed. "Trust me, among my people, I'm very open-minded about this issue, but most people aren't so progressive. How can an entire society be so stuck in their ways to view women as unsuitable leaders?" She huffed a little, and Cassis couldn't help but smirk a bit at her expression. Junko was still something of an oddity to him. She was so intelligent and hard-working, but he didn't understand why she dedicated so much effort to Andromeda. He was her prisoner, and by right had to obey her, but Junko would swing between loyal secretary to oppressed prisoner as well. Maybe she didn't truly know why she did this herself. He knew others who were so dedicated to their work they became blind as to why they did it. "How's my niece doing?" he asked, changing up the subject, and his smile grew a bit as he saw her smile in return. "Oh, she's doing well. She started learning a bit about human culture and history. Not like the others I want to stress. But I mean some of our ancient history pre-spaceflight, and she's fascinated by our golden age. She's very smart. I hope you're proud of her." Cassis blinked as Junko gave him a look he couldn't quite determine. "I am," he assured her. "I was proud of her even before all this. Tell me, I've heard you mention a human golden age before. This isn't it? You have spread wide and your military must be massive. Not to mention the technology gained through such a long and protracted war." He was also somewhat curious about human history, but he had trouble tearing himself away from learning about the struggle between the Confederacy and Conglomerate. To witness the death of a nation was new to him. For as long as the Desvians have struggled to build their kingdom, none of the other major players have been conquered, their borders merely shifting back and forth bit by bit. No. The Golden Age as we know it was a period of time after our first development of jump drives. Our homeworld Earth and the entire Sol system was rather heavily overpopulated at the time, and it began a mass exodus of settlers to new systems. This was followed by several important scientific discoveries and important industrialists making the drives and ships cheaper and faster almost every year. So we expanded very quickly through empty systems. For over 100 years, in fact, there was an era of unprecedented growth and prosperity without a single major conflict. She sighed a little at that last part, and he was about to ask what brought an end to the era when the door opened. "Is it time for another history lesson?" Cassis looked over and nodded to the human officer Stahl. He appreciated the input from the captain in the little battle lessons he had been shown recently. As much as he disliked the man's allegiance to a crazy pirate, he understood the captain was dedicated and loyal, which he appreciated. "I believe it's time." Cassis nodded as he spoke in his limited English. "What are we exploring today?" Stahl asked as he looked at Junko. I was thinking it might be time to examine the second battle of Castor." Cassis noticed the immediate change in the man's stance. His smile faded and his shoulders seemed to dip a bit as if they were suddenly heavy. He looked from Junko to Cassis and then slowly nodded. "I suppose it's necessary." He turned to the holotable set up in the room then and began to activate it. This was the last true battle of the war. The maiden voyage of the Retribution, then called Castor's Pride and Andromeda's first battle as commander of a large-scale fleet. Andromeda commanded the fleet? Not her father? Cassis asked then as he stepped up to the table, seeing a map of the Castor system come up. One of the Castor systems. He remembered that there were the twin sons of Castor, and this system was close, but different. A Congo assassin who had been waiting on Castor itself shot the admiral as he was leaving a final meeting with the Confederate government on the planet. The bullet was coated with... He used a word then that Cassis didn't understand, but he expected it was some sort of poison. In order to try and save the admiral, he was brought to the medical bay here on the ship. They couldn't save his body, but they were able to preserve his mind and connect it with the ship's AI. His last words before being sedated were to give Andromeda command of the fleet. Cassis noticed how the human trailed off, then seeming to think about his words. Yet she was commander of Junior, Cassis mentioned, and the human nodded. A junior commander, yes. So the announcement was met with some resistance. But by that point in the war, the admiral had been made magistrate of the fleets. When it came to the navy, he was essentially a dictator. Whatever decree he made was now law. The only person who could overrule the decision was the magistrate of war. and she didn't. And the Congo invasion fleet was about to enter the system, so the other captains decided to honor his wish and give Andromeda command of the fleet. I'm sure her own relatively short yet distinguished career by that point helped. She was the daughter of their greatest commander. She might be more of the same. Cassus looked back at the map as icons began to appear around the second planet in the system. That was their homeworld then. Or, not their homeworld, but their capital. He still found it strange to think of nations made up of the same species rather than being unified. As the icons kept appearing, though he glanced over at Stahl. Is mistake? Too many icons. But to his surprise, the human shook his head. No mistake. He resumed talking, but was speaking so fast now Cassus had trouble keeping up. So he looked over at Junko, who began to translate, while Stahl spoke, so Cassus didn't miss anything. This was their last true fleet. Almost the entirety of Confederate naval forces by this point in the war. Stahl tapped a button, and a list began to scroll across the table before Junko kept translating. The Pride of Castor was the flagship, of course. There were 13 Praetorian-class battlecruisers, 7 of the older Leviathan class, and even 3 older dreadnoughts, which were being phased out as the war drew on. They were too bulky without being armored and armed enough to sustain concentrated fire. That's what the Pride of Castor was for. Cassus still marveled at the size of the ship. He'd never dreamed anything like this was possible. The Royal Navy had a great many ships and no doubt could easily outclass this ship in tonnage, but certainly not with a single ship. The construction must have needed an entire fleet's worth of resources. Then there were 15 more assorted battleships, 23 heavy cruisers, 25 light cruisers, 33 destroyers, and 26 frigates. Due to the nature of the war, they were making less frigates by the end. Cassus slowly shook his head as he looked at the assembled fleet. No carriers? He asked, and Junko blinked. Right, 6 heavy carriers. She tapped on another set of icons to bring up the carriers. He saw them list out what they were holding, and gasped as he realized each heavy carrier contained a full gross of strike craft. Each, which mean a full 864. Took him a moment to do the math. He had never heard of a battle with so many strike craft involved, though the history books was full battles between similarly sized navies. What are these? He asked, then pointing to another set of icons around the planet. Orbital defense platforms. By this point, Castor was the most heavily defended planet in all of human space. There were rings of platforms and a few guns on the surface itself capable of hitting ships in orbit. Cassus shook his head slowly. To think of how fiercely the humans defended their planets. He shuddered to think of attempting a ground invasion against a human planet. And the invasion fleet? He asked, then unsure of what was brought to fight against such a determined defense. Junko nodded to Stahl, who tapped on the table, and he saw the icons start to move in on the edge of the system, and they kept arriving. He looked over at the 2 humans, and then back at the table before he finally just rubbed his jaw trying to comprehend the numbers he was seeing. Roughly triple in size, Junko finally said as the list began to scroll across the screen. Their new Crusader-class super dreadnoughts were about half the size of the Retribution. But there were 3 of them. 58 battlecruisers of varied classes. Now Cassus did have to gasp. 44 battleships, 56 heavy cruisers, 71 light cruisers, 87 destroyers, and 101 frigates. They also had 10 carriers, but they employed a different design, and so their 10 held less strike craft than the 6 Confederate counterparts. 720 to the Confederate 864. 824 to 960 if you count the strike craft stationed in the super dreadnoughts. Cassus just looked at the table for a while, his eyes taking in the vast numbers of icons displayed. If this was to be the last battle of the war, he supposed it made sense that it would be a big one. He looked over at Stahl then. Which ship yours? But the captain shook his head. None of these. I was conducting Special Forces raids on occupied Confederate planets to retrieve lost forces and important officials who were trapped by the previous years of invasion. Cassus nodded as the human spoke slowly enough for him to understand. He waved at the table then as the conglomerate ships began to move forward, and Junko started translating once more. By this time, the conglomerate finally had a high admiral of the fleet who had been pushing Suvakov back without the same sorts of loses. A man named Jonathan Gibbs. Unlike his predecessors, he didn't try to match Suvakov's wit. He would build up massive numbers and then use some of the fleet to attack and draw Admiral Suvakov away from his true objective. The fleets sent against Suvakov were almost always lost in battle, but since he had another whole fleet to take systems and drive Suvakov back without engagement, it was effective. They were unaware that the admiral had been shot by their assassin, and so Gibbs expected that he would be facing Suvakov in this fight. Junko pointed at the table as Cassis saw the hostile ships began to push forward around the edges of the system. "What are they doing?" he asked, unsure why just the sides of the fleet were moving forward. Gibbs wanted this war to finally be over, so he figured that the only way to truly best Suvakov was to send 2/3 of his fleet forward to then surround the planet, and all the ships would close in once there was no hope for escape. They were also seeking to cut off Castor from what few supply ships were still coming in. She pointed out the supply line leading from the planet away from the conglomerate fleet and towards the deeper sections of the Confederate systems. Once the planet was surrounded, the fleet would close and engage. "So, Andromeda was given death order?" he asked in English. He wondered just how the pirate had survived, but Stahl just grinned. "You'd think that, but Gibbs had never fought Andromeda. He knew Victor was a brilliant defensive leader, that he would likely use the defensive stations to inflict as many casualties as possible, but in the end it wouldn't matter. Andromeda was not like that." Cassis watched the sides of the massive hostile fleet stretch out, the arms passing by Castor on either side. That's when the Confederate fleet suddenly surged forward. "No," Cassis muttered, but Stahl snorted. "Yes," he said in reply. Andromeda wasn't going to wait. She attacked. He began to point at the table then as Junko took over translating once more. Andromeda waited until most of Gibbs' fleet had passed by the edge of Castor to start her attack, because they would take longer to turn around and return to help. If they wanted to make better time, they'd have to take fire from the defense platforms. For right now his core fleet was about the same size as her own. At first, Gibbs didn't even order the extended fleet back. He thought this was some sort of feint or trick. As Cassis watched Andromeda's fleet closed in before the extended arms of the hostile fleet finally began to turn back. But they'd be hours away if he was reading the time scale correctly. "But 3 ships!" He tapped on the massive icons at the heart of the hostile fleet. "Cannon like Retribution?" He tried in English and Junko nodded. Yes, they each had large plasma cannons like the Retribution's main gun. However, they were smaller. Also, Andromeda had a trick. She had brought from the planet as many robotic barges as she could find. They were arrayed at the front of the ship. She pointed to the table, which began to zoom in on Andromeda's fleet. Soon he saw the wall of barges up ahead of the ship and wondered what they were for. But as they closed in on the hostile vessels, he finally understood. The massive bolts of plasma were arcing towards the Retribution, but a barge would move to block it, absorbing the blast and sparing the Retribution, while the Retribution's main gun was free to fire on the conglomerate ships as they closed in. "She had enough to get in close?" he asked, but Junko glanced at the floor and Stahl slowly shook his head. Cassis wondered why they both looked so solemn, but looked back at the table as the barges were soon hit by a wave of conglomerate bombers. He saw the Confederate fighters rush forward, and most of the hostile strike craft were soon destroyed. But without the barrier, the Retribution began to take hits. That's when he saw a frigate rush forward and into the path of fire from one of the massive plasma blasts. "Did she—" "I wasn't there," Stahl reminded him. "I was taught that she sacrificed them," Junko mentioned, and Cassis shook his head once more before another voice spoke up. "She didn't." Cassis and both the humans looked around for a moment until they all looked at the projector set into the ceiling. "Admiral Suvakov, I forgot you could hear us," Stahl said, seeming worried, and Junko gulped. "I don't talk much, but this recording lacks emotion." The voice was strange to Cassis. It sounded human, but there was a metallic deep edge to it. "When I was shot, my world became black. I thought perhaps I might finally see my beloved Tessa again, but then I awoke to screaming.